The kamikaze corps was really active. I mean, they were after our fleet like crazy. The ship's gunners ate and slept practically with their gun mounts, and because there was a bogey on the screen, it seemed like day and night. Well, then I did a wing over to see what happened to this other one, and it was heading to this field that we had just kind of damaged, then. So I poured full throttle to the Hellcat, and it responded well. And just as I was ready to pull the trigger, I reasoned, I said, hollering, "Don, get out of there, they're shooting at you from the shore batteries." But I squeezed the trigger anyway, and that one exploded. So that was my first air-to-air kills of the war.
You're being attacked.
For Don McPherson, the youngest of 7 children who endured the Great Depression working their Nebraska family farm, the journey into the wild blue yonder as an ensign in the Blue Water Navy was as swift as it was unexpected. He was only 16 years old when he graduated from high school in Adams, Nebraska in 1939.
And of course, we had to register for the draft at age 18. So after I'd registered, then I started thinking, well, now, do I just let them draft me, or what should I decide to do?
When the United States declared that a state of war had existed between it and the Japanese Empire since the attack on Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, on December 7, 1941, the lives, plans, and dreams of an entire generation were put on hold. Suddenly, the future could no longer be taken for granted. Now it would have to be won.
I'd already decided to go Navy because I had an older brother that was already in the Navy. And so that part was settled, but about that time in the news, the Navy came out with the idea that they were starting what they called a V5 program. And if you could pass a mental and a physical examination, then you could learn to fly through this V5 program. So fiance and I talked it over, and I decided that's what I wanted to do. So then the thing I had to do was convince my folks, because they thought flying was really a dangerous occupation. I joined the military in September of 1942.
The V5 Naval Aviation Cadet Program Don McPherson entered was first established by Congress on April 15, 1935. Originally, it required candidates to be between the ages of 19 and 25, have an associate's degree or 2 years of college, complete a bachelor's degree within 6 years of being commissioned, remain single until after graduation, and serve 3 additional years of active duty. During World War II, Navy pilot training had to ramp up rapidly, so the V5 program was modified. Candidates who passed a test could now enter the program without the college requirement and complete their academics during a rigorous 18-month training program. Don knew he wanted to fly, but there was some family resistance.
my mother says, but it's just so dangerous. I hate to see you do that. And I said, well, Mom, I'm going to serve my country. And I think I'd rather do it from the seat of an airplane rather than from a foxhole. So that did it then. So.
The Navy flight training program had the same stages as the Army program: pre-flight, primary, basic, and advanced. But it added a carrier landing stage for fighter and torpedo or dive bomber pilots.
In this V5 program, they moved you every 3 months. The Navy took over part of these colleges because their male enrollment was so down, And so I started out in Mount Vernon, Iowa, with Cornell College, and that's where I spent my first 3 months. And so we started out flying Cubs, Tailorcrafts, Arancas, those types of planes. And I was lucky enough, I don't know why, but I happened to be the first one in our group to solo. And I found out that the idea was that the first guy that solos gets dumped into the irrigation canal. There were bits of ice floating in the canal, so it didn't take me long to get out of there. The next base then was Norman, Oklahoma. They'd taken over a portion of University of Oklahoma. And there then we flew the Stearman. That's how we learned aerobatics in it. And we also, what they called the SNV. So that was kind of an upgrade as far as power was concerned.
The SNV, built by Vultee Aircraft, was used as an intermediate trainer for naval aviators during World War II. The SNV introduced students to a more powerful Pratt & Whitney R985 engine. It incorporated two-way radio communication, manually operated flaps, and a variable pitch two-blade propeller, a major step in preparing students to advance to more complicated, higher performance aircraft. Its annoying harmonics and rattling caused students to nickname it the Vultee Vibrator.
Well, after the 3 months there, then we went to Corpus Christi, and that was our final squadron. And most of the time there, then, we were flying the SNJ, or what the Air Force called the Texan. And of course, it was equipped like the Navy. It had the tail hook and those things.
You. And you. And the guy sitting next to you. And you, and you, and you. Every man in gunnery school must want to be a gunner. He must want his badge of courage and skill, the gunner's wings, which prove him a flying fighter.
World War II fighter pilots had to multitask, to say the least. In addition to flying the airplane, often victory and survival depended on their shooting skills. They spent hours training for deflection shooting, considering wind, aircraft speed, and other factors in order to lead the target, learning the mechanics of their guns and shooting at aerial targets towed by fellow pilots.
All this time then we were taking pistol shooting, rifle shooting. We got into a shotgun, skeet and trap shooting to teach us lead deflection, those type of things. I even messed around with the 30 caliber machine gun some, had to take one apart and put it back together. And so they were making our studies, really in depth. And so then as we progressed in the SNJ to fly wing on another person, and even formation takeoffs and that type of thing. And then it just kept progressing to where then we were actually shooting plain guns, at a target on the ground. They'd go up and they'd tow a nylon sleeve behind another plane, and we'd shoot at that, to get lead-in deflection and those type of things.
Don McPherson earned his commission in wings at Corpus Christi, Texas on August 12, 1944. The farm boy from Nebraska had become a United States naval aviator.
You couldn't be married while you're in cadet training, so my wife came down to Corpus Christi to my graduation, and we thought we'd get to go home, so we'd get married at home, and that didn't happen. They had orders cut for me already to go Daytona Beach to fly the F-6F Hellcat.
The Grumman F-6F Hellcat was the United States Navy's dominant fighter in the Pacific theater of war. Between 1942 and 1945, 12,275 Hellcats were produced at a unit cost of $35,045 each.
The only plane that I flew in combat was the Hellcat, and it's a dandy. It had a 19-to-1 kill ratio. I don't want to discount the Corsair. The Corsair was good too. It had a 17-to-1 kill ratio. I read somewhere along the line that a really large percentage of the aces of the World War II were Hellcat pilots.
Though the Vought F-4U Corsair shared the same power plant as the Hellcat, the 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, it was actually faster. It was a legendary fighter in the Pacific theater in its own right. Its unique sound caused the Japanese to nickname it Whistling Death. But the Corsair had operational difficulties on board aircraft carriers. It achieved prominence as a land-based fighter flown by the Marines.
We had to go to Great Lakes to check out carrier landings. They had two old luxury liners that they'd put flight decks on.
The Wolverine, formerly the Lake Steamer C&B, has been converted for training purposes. Before the war, the Wolverine, a coal-burning side-wheeler, plied the stormy Great Lakes waters. Thousands of holiday passengers paraded her decks. Now she serves a grimmer purpose, training fighter pilots for all-out sky battle.
And one of them had been an old paddle wheel job that they put a flight deck on, and it couldn't move a hood of the water worth of a hoot. But so you had to have at least a 25-mile-an-hour wind over the deck in order to land on it. And they were a lot smaller than the regular carriers were.
When Pearl Harbor was attacked on December 7, 1941, there were 6,000 sailors training at the Great Lakes Naval Training Center on the shores of Lake Michigan in northeastern Illinois. By September, there were over 100,000. Between 1942 and 1945, over 15,000 naval aviators were trained for carrier landings on Lake Michigan. Two retired passenger ships, renamed Wolverine and Sable, were converted into mock carriers. Neither had armor or weaponry. It took almost $2 million and 1,200 workers to transform the opulent upper decks of the Wolverine into a 535-foot runway. The converted runways were more than 250 feet shy of those on real carriers. Those short runways, combined with the lake winds, occasional waterspouts, and poor visibility due to smoke from the ship's engines, made difficult landings even tougher. Roughly 150 planes crashed, and at least one pilot froze to death in the water.
They took us out the first day by boat, and we stayed aboard all day in that carrier, watching others land and qualify. And the skipper of that ship was a pistol. I mean, he had a bullhorn, and anybody that made kind of a rough landing, well, then he was telling them off, with that loudspeaker thing. They sent us out the next day, and I qualified aboard the other one and got my 8 landings in. So then I did get to go home then for a 10-day leave, and they already had my orders cut for San Diego for deployment. When we went into the channel, Pearl Harbor, it was really a shock. I mean, it was just like a junkyard. They dredged all these blown-up ships, up on the sides, and twisted rusty metal everywhere, so you can really realize what had happened there. And we stayed then in the barracks on Ford Island. And I could look out my bunker window and see that battleship that they made the shrine out of was sitting on the bottom with just a little bit of the mast sticking up out of the water. I didn't get to stay with my unit the 3 months because Air Group 83 had formed in the States, and then they were finishing training as an air group on the island of Maui, and they lost a pilot in carrier landings, got killed in carrier landings. Somehow my name got pulled out of the hat, and I was flown over there, and when I got over there, they were all packed ready to go to combat.
Fighter Squadron 83, or VF-83, was an aviation unit of the Navy originally established on the 1st of May, 1944. March 10, 1945, AVG-83 replaced AVG-4 and embarked on board the Essex.
Then we went aboard the Essex, the USS Essex, which was the first big carrier that was built after the war started. It was commissioned in 1942. And that night, we were down on the hangar deck watching a movie, and all of a sudden they sounded general quarters, and there were 2 kamikaze suicide planes, twin-engine planes, come in. One attacked our ship, but he overshot and clipped the radar mast that crashed on the island, and the other one had a glancing blow on the carrier anchored next to us.
Don McPherson's group, AVG-83, went aboard the Essex in Ulithi Harbor in the Caroline Islands. A little over a week after leaving Ulithi, Essex, with the other fast carriers in the group, took part in an attack on the Japanese home islands.
We went on a experiencing a rocket mission on the airfield in Kyushu, which is the southernmost island of the big islands of Japan. We got them out of bed, which we hoped to do, and We could see them running, trying to get to their planes and stuff, so that there was no airborne aircraft to be concerned about. So we just picked out targets of opportunity on the ground of this big twin-engine Betty bomber sitting there on the tarmac. So I shot my rockets and I strafed it, and I stayed in my dive long enough to see it explode, and then I was getting low enough I had to pull out pretty fast. And when I pulled out, my engine quit. But then when I got that surge from the engine starting, that power, pulled me back into those. So I went home that first day with holes in my airplane. There was one 20 millimeter that went through the fuselage about a foot behind my back. On the way back to the carrier, it flew kind of funny and not just right, it just didn't handle right. When I landed and pulled forward, then there's always a sailor come out and help you unbuckle and stuff like that. And he crawled up on the wing and he says, "I see you picked up a little lead today." And I said, "Well, where?" And he said, "Well, there's a hole right about a foot behind your back," he said. What had happened then, it had cut the cable that controlled the rudder on the tail surface. So I didn't have any rudder control, so I wasn't flying quite right. But I was probably the luckiest guy in the world. That's the only hole I ever picked up in about 88 missions, so that worked out all right. We were hitting kind of the finish up of Iwo Jima and the Philippines. Both of those were winding down. So we had a few missions, strafing missions and stuff there. But basically then we started hitting the home islands of Japan and also some against Okinawa.
We're ready again for This Is Assault on Your Morale. 75 minutes of music and news for our friends, our enemies in the South Pacific. Well, how are my little darling little dopes tonight? Full of beer and belligerence? What you need is some good jive. I mean solid. Helps you relax. All set? Okay, here's the first blow at your morale. So tired of singing and singing. Hey, Pop, I don't want to go to work. Please be listening.
Tokyo Rose was the collective name given to English-speaking female broadcasters who spoke directly to our troops in the Pacific over Japanese radio in hopes of demoralizing them. Troops were often frustrated by her inside knowledge of what their attack plans were. But in the case of Air Group 83, it may have been the propagandist who became frustrated.
We kind of had Tokyo Rose confused because she thought that we had two fast carrier task forces when it was just us moving back and forth, Finally, one night she come on then, and they had it figured out finally that they decided it was just one big fleet that was just scooting back and forth.
These hit-and-run attacks were only the beginning, however. Essex and the rest of her group were to be key players in a far more important task beginning April 1st, 1945, Operation Iceberg, the invasion of Okinawa.
Carrier planes go aloft to begin the 9-day bombardment preceding the invasion of Okinawa, large strategic island in the Ryukyu chain. Air attacks leading to landings at Okinawa are unrelenting. Throughout the entire 800-mile island chain, bombers and fighters attack in constant waves.
The battle for the island of Okinawa literally meant life or death on multiple levels. Strategically, the Japanese understood that if they lost the island to the Allies, they would have a base from which they could easily strike the home islands by air. They had to defend it at all cost. The initial invasion of Okinawa on April 1, 1945, was the largest amphibious assault in the Pacific theater of World War II. It lasted 82 days, from April 1st until June 22, 1945. The Allies were planning to use Okinawa, a large island only 340 miles away from mainland Japan, as a base for air operations for a planned invasion.
That was Easter morning. Then they invaded Okinawa, and most of we fighters were carrying napalm bombs, which is a firebomb. So we were scorching the beach, and I've got a picture in our cruise book of all the ships that were lying offshore, bombarding battleships were banging away, on cruisers. They had one big rocket launcher that was shooting, preparing, trying to get to things so that the guys in their landing barges wouldn't all get killed,
The human cost of winning Okinawa was horrendous. The battle was one of the bloodiest of the war, with 160,000 plus casualties on both sides, 75,682 Allied and 84,166 Japanese. In addition, 149,425 Okinawans were killed, committed suicide, or went missing, a significant portion of the estimated pre-war 300,000 local population. Many military historians believe that the ferocity of the Japanese resistance on Okinawa led directly to the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Victor Davis Hanson, in his book Ripples of Battle, wrote, quote, "Because the Japanese on Okinawa were so fierce in their defense, even when cut off and without supplies, and because casualties were so appalling, many American strategists looked for an alternative means to subdue mainland Japan other than a direct invasion. This means presented itself with the advent of atomic bombs, which worked admirably in convincing the Japanese to sue for peace unconditionally without American casualties."
They call it kamikaze, meaning the divine tempest. We call them suicide planes.
One day then they ordered our division of 4, 1 or 5 to hit this little airfield on Kikishima. It's a small island. They thought that probably was the base for a lot of these suiciders that were harassing the fleet.
Manned by pilots wearing the ceremonial red sash of the Kamikaze Corps. They specialize in one-way trips. Japan's secret weapon. It was a maniacal, all-out effort to smash our sea power, isolate our troops on Okinawa.
The suiciders were kamikazes, part of the Japanese special attack units of military aviators who initiated suicide attacks against Allied naval vessels in the closing stages of the Pacific Campaign. They were designed to destroy warships more effectively than was possible with conventional air attacks. About 3,862 kamikaze pilots died during the war, and more than 7,000 naval personnel were killed by them.
The Kamikaze Corps was really active. I mean, they were after our fleet like crazy. There was a 10-day period there where the ship's gunners ate and slept practically with their gun mounts, and because there was a bogey on the screen, it seemed like day and night. We went over with rockets and we tore the place up pretty bad and even damaged the runways and some things like that. And on the way back then, why, we probably were only about 1,800 feet off the water or so. And all of a sudden, here was these two dive bombers coming at us on a converging course, but they were real low on the water. I was lucky enough I hadn't put my guns back on safety, and I had some munition left, so all I had time to do was just to push the nose down and put my sight on them and squeeze the trigger, and I saw the pilot slump and they crashed into the ocean. Well, then I did a wing over to see what happened to this other one, and it was heading for this field that we had just kind of damaged, then. So I poured full throttle to the Hellcat, and it responded well. And just as I was ready to pull the trigger, normally we were on radio silence, but my aviation said, hollering, "Don, get out of there, they're shooting at you from the shore batteries." But I squeezed the trigger anyway, and that one exploded. So then I did a lot of evasive maneuvering to get out of there so I didn't get shot down myself. So that was my first air-to-air kills of the war. Well, by then we got called a lot of times to support our troops. And to me, that was the toughest duty that I ever drew, because they would have some Japanese pocketed up in those mountains and hills and tombs and caves. The only way they could get them out of there would be with flamethrowers, and so that put our guys in such a risk. So they would give us a spot on our grid maps, and we'd come in over one ridge and dive and fire our rockets into those and help them out that way. And the reason I say it was tough, because you had no room for error. But we got by with it, and was a lot of help to them. It's probably 10 days or more after the invasion of Okinawa, where they had a lot of these destroyer ships of ours were hanging between Okinawa and the southernmost island of Japan as radar pickets. So they sent us over there one day to fly combat air patrol over that. We got over, the attack had already started. They estimated now that there's somewhere between 250 and 300 kamikazes, and they were flying everything that would fly. Well, we got into a lower group almost right on the water, that flying even float planes, and some of them they claimed that they thought they had a flammable material in the pontoons. So then we started in on those, and my division leader saw what was happening, and he got on the radio and he said, "Guys, split up and get all of them that you can." I ended up shooting down 3 then, which made me an ace.
Don McPherson became a combat ace, a fighter pilot with 5 or more confirmed victories, on May 5, 1945. The battle for Okinawa ended June 22, 1945.
21 days after the New Mexico experiment, a B-29 was over Hiroshima carrying an atomic bomb.
On August 6, 1945, the first of 2 atomic bombs which effectively ended the war was dropped on Hiroshima, Japan.
We were close enough, we got to see the first atomic bomb drop. I was back off of the flight, and they announced on the PA system, so if you look to the west, you see a big measuring cloud in the United States to drop the first atomic bomb. We didn't know there was such, we had never heard of it. But We had put in 90 days of first cruise, and we went into the Philippines so that they could fix up some damaged carriers we'd gotten into a typhoon. And it bent the flight deck on two of the carriers, and it broke about a fifth of the bow off one of the big cruisers. We kind of got a little R&R there, and then we went back out for the next 90 days. So it took us up to the end of the war then. And at the end then, we were almost to an airfield in Tokyo on a strafing mission one morning, and they announced over our radios to swing back over the ocean and jettison our armament that ceasefire had been called. So we did that, and then everybody split up. We were doing loops and Emmelmans and stuff, celebrating. Then the last thing we did then was fly combat air patrol over the signing of the armistice in Tokyo Bay.
The battleship Missouri, 53,000-ton flagship of Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet, becomes the scene of an unforgettable ceremony marking the complete and formal surrender of Japan. We are gathered here, representatives of the major warring powers, to conclude a solemn agreement whereby peace may be restored.
I earned 3 Distinguished Flying Crosses. They don't give you 3 medals, but they give you a star to put on, and 4 air medals. Presidential Unit Citation was given to us, and of course all the corresponding ones like the Pacific Medal and the Victory Medals and those, so there's quite a list of them. But the Air Medal and the Distinguished Flying Cross are the main ones.
In the 2 years since he had enlisted in September of 1942, Don McPherson had seen and done enough for several lifetimes. He'd convinced his mother that despite the perceived danger, he wanted to do his part in an airplane. 11,000 miles from Adams, Nebraska, he fulfilled his rendezvous with destiny. He learned to fly. He became a combat ace. He fought one of the most pivotal and historic battles of the Pacific theater of World War II. He witnessed the dropping of the atomic bomb. He overflew the Japanese surrender in Tokyo Bay. He left the Navy at the end of the war and returned to Adams, Nebraska, a highly decorated combat ace. He has lived there humbly and quietly ever since. In a recent article about him in the local newspaper, the county veteran service officer said, Don McPherson returned to become a pillar of the community. Anybody who has grown up here knows him through scouts, baseball, softball, and other things.
We saw so much uniting and so forth with people during World War II. You know, everybody was into the situation, you know, that we had to keep our freedom. And it was just amazing to me, you know, how many airplanes they built in such a short time. That Grumman alone built 240 Hellcats in a month's time in 1943. And people were collecting scrap iron, and they were working 2 jobs, all to give us something to fight with. And I have to admit, I have no complaints with what they gave to me to work with. You know, I don't know if we'll ever see that kind of unity again, but I hope so.
In October of 1944, with the Allies pushing east towards Berlin, Germany launches an assault in the Ardennes forest. During the Battle of the Bulge, Nazi forces attempt to push American, British, and Canadian troops off the continent of Europe. On the other side of the world, Japan launches its own counteroffensive in the Pacific. Theirs is unlike anything America has seen before. Japanese aircraft head straight towards U.S. destroyers, battleships, and aircraft carriers, flown by men prepared to sacrifice their own lives. It is known as kamikaze, where pilots turn their planes into missiles. Suicide missions intended to cripple the American war machine as they inch closer towards the heart of Japan. These pilots follow the rule of divine wind. Loyal to the Emperor and their homeland, they are willing to die for both. Their weapons are their bodies. Their targets are American ships, pilots, and sailors. This is a story from two different perspectives, from the men willing to die for their country, and from the men determined to stop them. By 1944, the Empire of Japan is in a state of retreat. The area in which they hoped to create a Greater Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere is now a distant memory. The spirit of late 1941, when the land of the rising sun seemed invincible, has vanished. Since America's victory at Midway, the United States takes back island after island from Hirohito's forces. Japanese fighter aircraft are outnumbered by more modern American planes, being produced from the factories in droves. Experienced Japanese pilots are in short supply. In addition, the proximity fuse is utilized, making it almost impossible for Japanese bombers to get anywhere near U.S. naval vessels. No longer do they control the Pacific with an iron fist. By January of 1944, even those in the top circles of Japanese power have concluded that the war is lost. For a nation dependent on imports, they are denied the raw materials desperately needed to continue the war. Japanese merchant ships carrying oil, coal, and other goods are either attacked from the sky or torpedoed by American submarines. Production in Japan is slashed to shreds. To make matters worse, a naval blockade is causing severe shortages in food and materials, resulting in mass starvation. On paper, the war is all but won by the United States.
Really, by the fall of 1944, it's clear from Hirohito's recent biographers who've really studied the Japanese documents, by the fall of 44, he knew Japan had lost the war. But surrender was not on the table because of this notion of honor, and he was also really obsessed with protecting the sort of royal regalia, the symbols of the emperor's authority. And, all through the summer of 45, the Japanese press was running what Hirohito's biographer Herbert Bix called the Die for the Emperor campaign. I mean, this was the message to the whole society.
As the American invasion forces got closer and closer to the homeland, it became an even bigger and more purposeful strategy to not necessarily to win the war, but to make the cost of getting closer and closer to the Japanese homeland so great that they'd be able to achieve a negotiated peace.
For America, the road to Tokyo has been a bloody affair, with thousands of troops killed in the process. The Japanese proved themselves to be warriors, fighting until their last breath, based on a sacred samurai code known as Bushido. Surrender is not an option for its citizens, who are told that they will be shamed forever if they give in to the Americans.
The Army and Marines had certainly encountered this in some of the islands that were taken where Japanese civilians committed suicide rather than be taken prisoner, and they were essentially told and ordered to, oh, you don't know what's going to happen to you, and it's part of this honor not to be taken prisoners. So there had been this sort of preview of the same mentality that American forces had encountered already.
United States generals realized that if the resistance on these islands is this fierce, the invasion of Japan itself could be the mother of all bloodbaths.
The rules of war were that you fought until your last breath, and that was expected of your enemy as well. So the concept of surrendering was something that the Japanese military did not recognize or respect. And it had big consequences on both sides during the conflict, that it was no quarter on both sides.
With the acquisition of island outposts by U.S. forces, landing strips are prepared for the arrival of the massive B-29 superfortress. Being twice the size and having twice the range of the B-17, this gigantic bomber is what America hopes will be the deciding factor in the Pacific, having the capability of flying over Yokohama, Nagoya, and the capital city of Tokyo, allowing for a massive bombardment of the Japanese home islands.
Massed B-29 attacks, hundreds of bombers flying in close formation, dropping incendiaries, were extraordinarily effective in burning Japanese cities. There's no question about that. The attack in Tokyo, again, this is conventional bombs, incendiaries, burned square miles of the city, did huge amount of damage, probably caused 100,000 or so civilian deaths, rivaling what possibly even exceeding what the atomic bombs did.
If the war can be won from the air, hopefully a D-Day style invasion in the Pacific can be avoided. Yet, despite all the deaths and starvation throughout Japan, its military still refuses to acquiesce to the demands of an unconditional surrender. By mid-1944, with American forces ready to take back the Philippines, it becomes clear that the people of Japan will not accept defeat without a fight to the death. Their loyalty is to Emperor Hirohito, and the idea of foreigners occupying the homeland is a concept completely alien to them. They would rather die than surrender to America. It is this belief system that allows the kamikaze fighter to emerge.
A lot of people who've written about the kamikaze suggest that there's some origins in the Shinto religion and the samurai code, and I think that's undeniably true, but it's also stretching it. That there was this, certainly a Japanese martial tradition, there was this notion of personal loyalty to the emperor, and that was clearly driving it. Hirohito himself was very impressed and very supportive of the whole idea of these special attack forces and thought, well, this is the supreme expression of the devotion of the Japanese people to their emperor personally. That's how he viewed it.
In order to protect a perimeter of islands giving America the ability to bomb Japan, squadrons of volunteers begin enlisting for their own version of a divine wind against the United States.
A decision was made, and basically it was during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, that the best chance they had of taking out an American fleet, an American invasion fleet, was to purposely crash their aircraft into these ships.
Unable to sink numerically superior aircraft carriers through traditional methods, they instead must resort to the doctrine of kamikaze.
If this had been the United States and the Japanese were advancing on our homeland, and we had disadvantages in terms of resources, aircraft, and pilots, and wanted to fend off an advancing enemy, certainly, anything becomes possible.
Under the leadership of Admiral Onishi, thousands of men trained for what will be their last mission. A true believer in the Bushido Code, Onishi, with the Emperor's blessing, begins organizing a suicidal war plan. The Oka, a piloted rocket bomb, is authorized along with a human torpedo known as the Kai-10, as weapons to be used against American ships.
There were a small number of special purpose kamikaze aircraft built, the most famous of which was the so-called Cherry Blossom, which was basically a bomb with stubby wings and a cockpit welded on top and a solid rocket motor, and this was dropped from a bomber. The solid rocket motor would be used to accelerate this into a dive approaching 600 miles per hour, so that was particularly difficult to counter when you had such a high terminal speed.
These are in addition to the thousands of kamikaze pilots being trained for their final act in uniform. The goal is simple: fly straight into American ships, and hopefully, with the mixture of fire and gasoline, the explosion causes the vessel to sink.
One pilot and one plane can take out a ship that may have 300 sailors, 500, maybe as many as 3,000 sailors with one well-placed hit. And in a number of occasions they did that or came close to doing it on many others.
And because the decks of American aircraft carriers are made of wood, the probability of a ship going down is even more likely. A key target then for the kamikaze pilots is the central deck elevator, believing that a successful attack can, at the very least, disable the carrier. The advantages of the kamikaze are numerous. Pilots need very little training. Obsolete aircraft can be used, and even if planes are hit by a proximity-fused shell, the momentum can hopefully keep the aircraft on target. The average kamikaze pilot is given a 1-week crash course in suicide attacks. 2 days are spent practicing takeoffs, another 2 to study formation flying, with the last 3 days spent on how to strike a target successfully.
It was a case where some very young pilots were kind of dragooned into doing this. Some older, experienced pilots who were gung-ho were ready to go and do it and maybe had to be restrained, but it went all along the spectrum, I think.
Crash diving, however, is not as simple as it may appear on paper. The powerful lift generated from the high winds makes it difficult to keep the nose of an aircraft on target. Also, there is the strong possibility of pilots blacking out from the heavy gravitational forces when they come crashing down. This entire strategy is a huge gamble, but for the Japanese, with their cities being destroyed, it is their only card left to play. By 1944, as the Americans are set to take back the Philippines in the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the first waves of kamikaze attacks are unleashed. Before taking off, Admiral Onishi tells his men as they drink sake, "You are already gods, without earthly desires. Your own crash dive is not in vain. Regrettably, we will not be able to tell you the results, but I shall watch your efforts in the end and report your deeds to the throne." On October 25th, a special attack unit led by Lieutenant Yukio Seki spots an American ship, the St. Lo. Diving straight down, his aircraft hits the ship's deck, exploding like a fireball. Going right through its wooden frame, subsequent explosions begin interacting with torpedoes and bombs on board the vessel, and a new chapter in Second World War history begins.
Then it struck. They call it kamikaze, meaning the divine tempest. We call them suicide planes, manned by pilots wearing the ceremonial red sash of the Kamikaze Corps. They specialize in one-way trips. Their destination, the deck or hull of any American ship onto which planes, bombs, burning gasoline, and red-sashed pilot flashed.
Waves of kamikaze attacks are given the green light by Onishi, with targets not being limited to just strictly naval vessels. With the bombardment of Japanese cities by B-29 superfortresses, orders are given to attack these bombers with the same ferocity. The results prove disappointing. With the B-29's defensive armament that includes remote-controlled gun turrets, kamikaze planes are unable to stop these massive bombers from pulverizing the land of the rising sun.
The Japanese pilots would call them ice castles because they were so far up, and there was no need to camouflage the planes because you weren't. Their elevation was to keep them from having Japanese planes assault them. It was only when tactics changed, when there was a move to more low-level bombing, that the Japanese planes were able to attack them. Even then, there were many instances where the B-29s could actually outrun a Japanese fighter aircraft, was faster than the aircraft that was trying to pursue them.
And with a scorched earth strategy being carried out, the kamikaze fighter is in a race against the clock. Despite the destruction these tactics are having on American ships, the United States government does not retreat. Their final push to Tokyo will not be derailed, no matter what the cost. So for the next 10 months, American servicemen accept the possibility that today could be their very last.
For the kamikazes, psychologically, I don't think they were prepared at all. It just was such a foreign concept to these young guys, on a ship or in the air, to see somebody who would purposely sacrifice themselves as a way of trying to win a battle. It just was unimaginable to them.
I think that probably the greatest effectiveness of the kamikazes was that it was so incomprehensible to the American military leadership, American society, American understanding. And it did, I mean, don't get me wrong, there was a very real material effect of the kamikaze attacks, but I think the psychological effect really was quite powerful. That it was so hard for American soldiers and sailors and airmen to get their minds around this mentality of people who were willing to do this. And of course, it was very hard to answer. I mean, normally a lot of what air defense and self-defense in general is based on is the idea that this guy is trying to save his life, is trying to avoid being hit, doing something crazy. So it was very hard to answer this.
Hopefully, with the hundreds of guns, rockets, and shells on board destroyers, cruisers, frigates, and battleships, these sailors can shoot down the kamikaze before it is too late. In dealing with this menace, a strategy known as the Big Blue Blanket is employed by naval aviator John Thatch. The plan calls for around-the-clock surveillance by fighter planes over the American fleet, increased attacks on Japanese airfields, and stationing destroyer escorts 50 miles away from the main body to alert the other ships of any approaching Japanese aircraft.
Developing this whole system of radar picket ships that would spot the incoming kamikaze forces, keeping air patrols deployed really around the clock during some of the operations to try to intercept them. So still some did get through. Even in the Battle of Okinawa, it was mainly small ships, American ships, that were sunk. There were no large carriers or battleships that were actually, really put out of action and were sunk by the kamikaze attacks.
This strategy proved successful in disrupting the kamikaze. With Japan in a weakened state, skilled pilots become scarce. As a result, gunmen are finding it easier to shoot down oncoming planes being manned by inexperienced pilots. Despite the toll suicide attacks are taking on soldiers' psyches and lives, most notably on the USS Bunker Hill and the USS Franklin, where hundreds of servicemen are killed, the kamikaze is facing an equally fierce counterstrike.
Ultimately, it was the American military forces were so overwhelmingly powerful, this wasn't going to stop them. It could cause a lot of casualties, it could inflict a lot of pain along the way, but it wasn't sufficient at any point to even derail American strategic decisions. It caused tactical redeployments, it caused an American diversion of forces to try to deal with the kamikazes, but it couldn't alter American strategy.
The attacks reached their zenith during the battle for Okinawa, where hundreds of suicide planes are used in this pivotal conflict.
They did cause a lot of casualties. The climax was probably the Battle of Okinawa, where close to 2,000 kamikaze attacks took place.
A joint order is written by both the Japanese Army and Navy, establishing suicide as an official policy. This results in 30 American ships sunk and 300 badly damaged in the fight for Okinawa. In the end, the United States takes the island, but only after 12,000 American and 110,000 Japanese deaths. The effect of the kamikaze is being felt in Washington, D.C., where military and civilian planners decide what to do with Japan. Even with the unprecedented bombardment of their cities by B-29s, with the death toll being in the hundreds of thousands, the demand for an unconditional surrender is still not being met. Kamikaze missions, in addition to the fierce resistance offered on Okinawa and Iwo Jima, make generals like George Marshall favor the use of an atomic bomb. The Japanese had demonstrated in each case they would not surrender, said the general. We had to end the war. We had to save American lives. Since President Harry Truman takes office following the death of Franklin Roosevelt, American casualties reached nearly half the total of 3 years of battling against the Japanese in just 3 months.
It was something to contemplate. I remember the terrible anxiety through which the people in Washington went, and I was one of them, wondering what would happen when we attempted to take the main islands of Japan.
Conventional wisdom leads the commander-in-chief to believe that the casualties resulting from a mainland invasion of Japan could be enormous, possibly in excess of 1 million men. For that reason, the decision to drop the first atomic bomb in history is approved by the president. On August 6th, the first nuclear weapon in history is used on the city of Hiroshima, and days later, a second bomb is dropped on the city of Nagasaki. After unprecedented carnage, the demand for an unconditional surrender is finally met. With the defeat of the Japanese comes the defeat of the kamikaze. The impact of these suicide attacks is still hotly debated.
At the time, in 1945, it was seen as a barbarian approach to warfare, an unheard of approach to warfare. 60 years later, you can start to equivocate and say, well, listen, they had to do this. It was in their interest, and it was an honorable tactic.
The ships that were sunk as a result of kamikaze planes vary from the mid-30s to the high 50s. Approximately over 4,000 sailors were killed and another 4,000 wounded. However, the entire goal of the kamikaze backfires, causing war planners who may have still been on the fence in terms of whether to drop the atomic bomb or not, to support a nuclear attack on Japan. It was a strategy that grossly underestimated America's resolve in seeking an unconditional surrender from the land of the rising sun. For that reason, no number of suicidal pilots could have stopped the United States' war machine from achieving total victory.
Has there ever been a warplane as mythic as the Mitsubishi Zero? Legend, mystery, and rumor conflated to create an unbeatable fighter flown by samurai tough pilots. The Zero was said to have an awesome performance, superb maneuverability, and combat characteristics an order of magnitude ahead of anything else in the sky. The oft-forgotten fact is that the Zero's effective combat career was measured in months. The Mitsubishi A6M-0 is a long-range carrier-based aircraft fighter formerly manufactured by Mitsubishi Aircraft Company, a part of Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, and was operated by the Imperial Japanese Navy from 1940 to 1945. The A6M was designated as the Mitsubishi Navy Type 0 carrier fighter, or the Mitsubishi A6M Raisin. The A6M was usually referred to by its pilots as the Raisin, or Zero, being the last digit of the Imperial year 2600, or 1940, when it entered the service with the Imperial Navy. In the official designation A6M, the A signified a carrier-based fighter, 6 meant that it was the 6th such model built for the Imperial Navy, and M indicated Mitsubishi as the manufacturer. The official Allied report name was Zeke, although the name Zero was used colloquially as well. Not counting its earliest sucker punch missions over China, when the best trained fighter pilots in the world swatted down scores of ill-flown Polikarpov biplanes and open cockpit monoplanes. The Zero resigned supreme in the Pacific War, only from the day of the Pearl Harbor attack until American pilots learned the tactics that allowed even pudgy F-4F Wildcats to level the aerial playing field during the Guadalcanal campaign in the summer and fall of 1942. When the second generation of U.S. World War II fighters, the P-38, F-4U, and F-6F arrived beginning in early 1943, the Zero was finished as an effective fighter. In January 1944, a single Marine F-4U pilot, First Lieutenant Robert Hansen, shot down 20 Zeros in just 17 days. The Zero soldiered on until the end of the war. Of course, many self-immolating as kamikazes, but only because the Japanese had nothing to replace it, and the Zero often was simply a cannon fodder. The June 1944 Marianas Turkey shoot is the most notorious example of such inequity. Not that the Zero wasn't still dangerous even in the 1945s, especially if an aviator was cocky enough to try to dogfight one of the few remaining experienced Zero pilots. Nobody ever built a fighter that could outmaneuver it, and the fact that Grumman developed the F-8F Bearcat as Zero beater, a task that it was to do just a bit too late to fulfill, shows that the Zero was never entirely disdained. The Japanese had counted on a short, brutal war to force the US to the negotiating table in order to establish unfettered area of Japanese exploitation in South Asia and the Pacific. So Japan had done little to prepare for a protracted conflict. Zero pilots were superbly trained, but only hundreds at a time. Then a few thousand a year while the US was turning tens of thousands of college grads into pilots. The great majority of Japanese pilots were the equivalent of our NCOs. Nor was the production of a Zero successor given high priority. Much like the German High Command initially assumed the Me-109 would suffice for the duration of the war and that it didn't need an engineer or a successor, the Japanese waited too long to develop and produce the Shiden, Raiden, and Reppu, or perhaps they should have developed just one of them. It didn't help that Japan, a small island nation with limited engineering and manufacturing manpower, spent its time dithering over the development of more than 90 major combat types as well as several dozen lesser models. By the time they did get serious, raw materials were lacking and the country's skilled airframe and engine workforce had fled the manufacturing centers due to being bombed out of their homes. The Zero was incrementally improved throughout the war, from the A6M2, the first model to take on American fighters, to the A6M8. Only 2 ever built, intended to attack B-29s. The Zero's excellent Nakajima-built Sake engine was eventually upgraded by about 150 horsepower, but it never attained anything like the horsepower offered by the Pratt & Whitney R2800, the P-38's twin Allisons, or the P-51's Packard Merlin. The Zero's power-to-weight ratio was always better than that of its US opponents, but sheer horsepower allowed the Americans to loft superior firepower, substantial armor, and overbuilt airframes. What the Japanese needed and never got was not a better Zero, but an all-new fighter, a Japanese Hellcat. When the war ended and the Zero stood down, the US was within a week of introducing yet a third generation of Pacific fighters in the form of the Bearcat. The Zero began the Pacific War with an aura of invincibility. At the time of the attack on Pearl Harbor, 521 Zeros were active in the Pacific. 328 in first-line units. The carrier-borne Model 21 was the type encountered by the Americans. Its tremendous range, over 2,600 kilometers, allowed it to range farther from its carrier than expected, appearing over distant battlefronts and giving Allied commanders the impression that there were several times as many Zeros as actually existed. After Pearl Harbor, it quickly became to be viewed as some kind of mystery ship, imbued with strange powers, able to do things that no other airplane could. Yet it was simply a well-engineered, straightforward, optimized aircraft for maneuverability, and flown against an enemy that had never credited the Japanese with the ability to design a cutting-edge fighter. Even though the Claire Chennault of Flying Tigers had been sent back to the US, reports of the airplane's capability over China, they were ignored, and American aircraft recognition manuals didn't even include a picture of the Zero. As aviation historian William Green wrote, the Zero created a myth, the myth of a Japanese invincibility in the air. Its successive appearance over every major battle area in the opening days of the war seemed to indicate that the Japanese possessed unlimited supplies of this remarkable fighter. And its almost mystical powers of maneuver and ability to traverse vast stretches of water fostered the acceptance of a myth of its invincibility in Allied minds. Zeros often showed up so far from the nearest Japanese-controlled land that the Americans set out in search of the carrier from which it was assumed they'd taken off. The Zero was designed by a team under the direction of the brilliant young aeronautical engineer Jiro Horikoshi. Mitsubishi had the foresight to send Horikoshi to work and observe at aircraft factories in Europe and in the US in 1929, and he even spent several months at Curtiss Plant in New York as an acceptance inspector for a batch of P-6 Hawk pursuit biplanes the Japanese had ordered. Horikoshi had already engineered the Mitsubishi A5M, later codenamed the Claude by the Allies. For an open cockpit, fixed-gear fighter, the A5M displayed outstanding performance, in no small part because of its flush riveting, a production technique that the Japanese would subsequently use on the Zero at a time when American airframers were just discovering its low drag advantage. In order to fight not only the already overmatched Chinese, but also the Pacific War against the US that was beginning to look inevitable, however, Japan still needed something more than just the Claude. The Japanese would never have attacked Pearl Harbor if they didn't have the Zero. At the time, in fact, some planners had misgivings that there weren't yet enough Zeros available for the attack to succeed. When the Japanese Navy gave Mitsubishi its marching orders as the Zero design began, it demanded a triple threat: an escort with the extreme range that needed to accompany bombers deep into China and later to cover over vast Pacific distances, a point defense interceptor with a rapid rate of climb to hit attacking bombers before they reached their targets, and a consummate dogfighter with extreme maneuverability. Though it's often assumed that the Japanese Army Air Force also flew Zeros, it never did. Another Zero oddity is that though all Japanese naval aviators were carrier qualified, many, including the famous Zero super ace Saburo Sakai, never operated from a carrier in combat. The extreme range criterion resulted in one piece of a little acknowledged pioneering for which the Zero was responsible. It was the first airplane designed from inception to carry an ejectable external fuel tank. A Zero's maximum fuel load, including the belly tank, typically was about 230 gallons. And this gave it 7 or 8 hours of combat endurance. Sakai set the Zero endurance record, just over 12 hours, by throttling back to 1,700 RPM and running what today we'd call lean of peak, maximum height exhaust gas temperature, at just 130 miles an hour. He intentionally ran his tanks bone dry while circling above Formosa Air Base after a mission and dead-sticked in from 8,000 feet. Another Zero innovation was its 360-degree view cockpit canopy, second only to the British Westland Whirlwind's bubble canopy. Though it was a multi-pane greenhouse rather than a true bubble, the Zero's glassware provided a considerably better rearward view than anything but a true open cockpit design, and had also excellent drag-reducing properties. It could also be opened in flight but not jettisoned, making parachute egress difficult. It was assumed that a Zero samurai would continue fighting to their death rather than bail out. Most Zero pilots refueled to wear parachutes in any case, until they ultimately were ordered to strap them on. In the late 1930s, the Japanese had developed nothing more powerful than several 800 to 1000 HP radials with little grown potential. At a time when American, British, and German manufacturers were cranking out 1,200 horsepower engines with 2,000 horsepower visible on the horizon. So Horikoshi needed to make his new fighter super light, which he did in part by having lightened holes cut and drilled through every internal airframe part possible, a technique that race car builders would recognize immediately. Horikoshi also persuaded the Navy to change its ultimate load standards for many components he didn't consider crucial. He designed them to fail, but then rebound them to previous shape as soon as they were reduced. As a result, the Zero was the fastest 1000 HP radial engine fighter ever produced, but one with a number of single-point failure locations that, if hit, could bring down the airplane. The Zero was skinned with the lightest gauge aluminum possible, and when the shadows were right, some photos of the Zeros in flight show them seemingly clothed in crinkled tinfoil. British test pilot Eric Brown, who flew a captured Zero immediately after the war, even today recalls the constant noise of the oil canning fuselage skin, like the sound produced when one pushes on the side of a large biscuit tin. A typical Zero, loaded with full fuel and ordnance, weighed about 5,500 pounds, less than a mid-sized Cessna twin. A fully loaded Hellcat weighed over twice as much. The single heaviest component of any airframe is the main wing spar. Horikoshi lightened the Zeros by 30% by using a new zinc aluminum alloy called Super Ultra Duraluminum, which had recently been developed by Sumitomo Metals. One major benefit of the 7075 over the Sumitomo metal was that it was very corrosion resistant. In another weight-saving measure, the Zero's main spar was continuous, from wingtip to wingtip, and thus was an inseparable part of the fuselage center section rather than having a left and right wing, each bolted to the fuselage. This eliminated the weight of fasteners and spar buckets. Though it might seem that permanently affixed wings could make a Zero difficult to transport, Horikoshi had designed the entire tail cone and empennage to easily unbolt just aft of the cockpit. With everything removed forward of the firewall as well, the wing and cockpit became a single long but light narrow truckload. Horikoshi's search for lightness led him to the oft-criticized failure to include adequate armor or self-sealing fuel tanks in the Zero design. What was forgotten, however, is that virtually no fighters at the time the Zero was introduced had such features. It remained for the Battle of Britain in the summer of 1940 to demonstrate the need for armor and protected tanks. In any case, the Zero's designers considered armor unnecessary because they didn't think anybody would be able to put any rounds into the fighter. Maybe a lucky shot here and there, but not enough of a danger to compromise the design's lightness. Little did they know what the Navy and Marines had in store for them. Most combat units also removed their Zero's radios for additional weight savings, since the Japanese transceiver was very poor quality. This left the Zero pilots unable to warn wingmen of surprise attacks, and they could coordinate their own attacks only with occasional hand signals. A typical multi-plane Zero attack was a melee of individual aerobatics, and Japanese pilots were in nearly as much danger of mid-airs with their mates as they were of getting shot at. As one of the USN pilots put it, from the way Zero pilots rollicked around in the sky, at times, it looked as they would rather stunt than fly. Yokonawa flew upside down, having both hands around the cockpit, wrote Sakai in his book Samurai. Then, he flew directly over me, under me, and went through a wide hesitation roll around my fighter. He was like a kid showing off. He finally flew on my wing and held the stick between his knees. Still grinning, he waved his lunchbox at me and started to eat. The Zero's flight controls mixed some ingenious engineering with at least one awkward feature. Its ailerons were large and powerful, which added greatly to the fighter's low-speed maneuverability and spectacular roll rate, but they were very difficult to deflect at high speeds. American pilots soon learned to dive and turn sharply, especially to the right, which substantial prop-induced torque made particularly difficult for the Zero when they had a Zero on their tail. Horikoshi did an interesting job with the Zero's elevator, however. The airplane's speed range was broad, from low-speed maneuvering to flat-out dashes at more than 300 miles an hour, and elevator effectiveness, of course, increased with speed, to the point where it could become quite touchy. So Horikoshi designed an elastic control system, with thin elevator cables that stretched a bit as speed increased and slightly flexible elevator control torque tube. Normally, such a setup would be an anathema to an aeronautical engineer, for it encouraged an elevator to flutter as speeds increased. But somehow, whether through luck or engineering talent, Horikoshi found a sweet spot where there was no danger of flutter, yet elevator control forces remained constant regardless of the airspeed. Zeros were feared in part because of the two heavy wing-mounted 20mm cannons, Swiss Oerlikons built under license by the Japanese. Horikoshi suspected that the Zero would yaw appreciably as first one and then the other cannon fired and recoiled, so he specified for a fuselage longer than its optimal length, which gave the vertical stabilizer a longer moment arm and thus provided greater longitudinal stability. But the Oerlikons were still problematic. They had a low rate of fire, limited capacity, initially only 60 rounds per gun, later increased to 100, and low muzzle velocity. The latter meant that the cannon was effective for close-in fighting, where a single round into a Wildcat's wing, root, or cockpit could mean a kill. But as the distance to a target increased, the cannon's rounds would lose energy and drop away ineffectually, like a softball thrown underhand. A number of the Zero's smaller components, such as instruments and engine accessories, were also license-built Bendix, Sperry, Colesman, and other designs, which could lead to later claims that the airplane was a copy of the Hughes H-1 Racer or the vaguely similar-looking Vought V-143. But as Horikoshi later wrote, we were trying to surpass the rest of the world's technology, not just catch up to it. The Zero's single most important US part was its Hamilton standard design constant speed propeller. The Japanese had also bought a V-143 in 1937, and the Zero's landing gear and retraction mechanism was almost certainly a copy of the Vought's design. After all, the Zero was one of the first retractables the Japanese built. The Zero's 2 cowl-mounted machine guns were not particularly effective, especially against the new generation of heavies overbuilt the US fighters. At little more than a half of the caliber of the American 50 cals, they were used by many Zero pilots mainly as pointers for their cannons. If they saw hits from the machine guns, they toggled the cannons alive and fired them instead. Just like a World War I Spot or Fokker, the Zero's receivers were in the cockpit, above the instrument panel on either side, and the pilot pulled levers to charge them. Ultimately, the Zero's main failing was that it was designed to a 1930s paradigm. Air combat meant dogfighting, and dogfighting, at least in the days before energy management, meant to circle chase in one form or another, with the better airplane turning tighter than the lesser one and eventually getting into a firing position from a rear quarter. Victory was then nearly inevitable. And the Zero was the world's tightest turning, most maneuverable fighter. Thanks to its aerobatic ability, Zero pilots also developed a combat maneuver that initially baffled American airmen, a kind of sideways loop with square turns and side slips out of the turns, which tightened their turn greatly. It didn't take long, however, for American pilots to learn that the rat racing with the Zero was a loser's game, so they disbanded tail chases that played straight into the Zero's only air combat strength. It was neither strong, unusually fast, good in a dive, nor effectively armed. Hit and run became the mantra. Attack a Zero from above, fire while diving upon it, and keep going. Convert diving energy into zooming altitude and do it again if necessary. Perhaps it was inevitable that the Zero would become a myth, a legend, a paragon amongst fighters, when it was in fact a conventional plane with several ahead of its time characteristics. It could be argued that the Zero was an excellent airplane, but a lousy fighter. If you discount the victories over poorly trained Chinese pilots flying outmoded Soviet fighters, the huge fleet of Allied aircraft destroyed while they were parked in the opening days of the war, and the kills of utterly unprepared American pilots in many cases flying adequate airplanes but using the wrong tactics against the Zero, the mythical Mitsubishi comes off surprisingly poorly. It was extremely light and had numerous failure points, where very few rounds of heavy caliber machine gun fire could do catastrophic damage. It was flammable, and its pilots were terribly vulnerable. It was not particularly fast, and in any case, its high-speed handling was poor. Its controls were poorly harmonized. Its armament was a mixed bag of 2 light machine guns and crude cannons. It had no useful communications equipment. Ultimately, the Zero was a bare-bones airplane. Nothing extra, nothing fancy. With very little margin for modification, designs which had little, if any, stretch built into them, wrote Zero expert Robert Mikesh. Some say that because the Zero was the best dogfighter in the Pacific theater, perhaps the world, it was by definition the best fighter. But there's also an old saying, to win, you have to finish. Unfortunately for the Japanese, the Pacific War was one race that the Zero finished last. Dead last.
OK，把它回来。Enjoy. Stop.
一番の特徴はですね、私に言わせますならば、航続力ですね。
長い。
非常に長時間飛べるということです。どんな素晴らしい格闘性能を持っていても、時間がなくてはですね、いい試案は浮かばないですよ。だから私はもう航続力だと思うんです。第2番目が堀越先生、苦心の作であるところのこのエレベーター昇降舵ですね、この機首を上げ下げするこの舵の効き具合が、操縦桿の引き具合とこのエレベーターの効き具合が低速でも高速でも操縦するパイロットの考えてる通り動いてくれるように設計されてる。これがこの格闘性の特に縦の運動ですね、この宙返りを利用した縦の運動、これが非常に優れてたということです。そうですからもちろん真後ろついた場合はですね、どんなに彼らが逃げ回っても絶対我々がこの真後ろへピャッとつけたらですね、大体35、6メーターか40メーター、どんな逃げ方してもプロレスで言えばキーロックですね。ガツッとはめたらもう仕留めます。
もう逃げられない。
よっぽどのことじゃなければ。ただこういう具合にめったになりませんけど、なった時でもこの縦の運動に引っ込めば、大体3000点から4000点すれば挽回すると。そのくらいにゼロ戦の特徴というものは、この縦の運動のエレベーターを利用したところの、私なんかは斜め宙返りを利用したひねり込みと言ってましたけど、このひねり込みが古いパイロットには一人味のあるですね、自分流の技をですね、いつの間にか開発していきました。その当時ですね、本当に私たちがラボル国体で油の乗り切ってる頃、ちょうどこのスピンナーの先、この先端ですね、これはこう感じてましたよ。
一体なんですね、じゃあ。
それからこの先、翼端がですね、この中指に感じてましたね。そのくらいに完全に飛行機マスターしてましたから、もう地上で自分の体を動かすよりも空中で、ゼロ戦操縦してバーッと向ける方が速くて確実に行くぐらいに、完全に飛行機そのものが自分になってましたから。戦闘機というのはですね、周り360度全部敵ですから、もうむしろこう敵を探すとか見張る場合には、私なんかもう前を2、後ろを9と。
前を2、後ろを9、なるほど。
翼の裏と胴体のここが一番怖いんです。見えないところですから。どっから来るか分かりませんが、年中こう腰をひねってですね、飛行機をひっくり返しながら、自分の後ろが大丈夫かってことを見て、前はパッと見れば分かりますから、もうすぐ気になりますから、これを気にならない人はやられるんです。私たち考えてましたのは、非常に重量を軽く作ってありますから、非常に機体全般が弱かったですね。そうですからアメリカの飛行機には絶対そんなことないんですけども、もうこのゼロ戦には制限スピードというのがありまして、それを出すとバリッといくのが危ないんですね。いつも危険を感じてました。それから第2番目が、弾を食らった場合に、全く覚えようがないということです。最後のこれはパイロットあたりちょっとカバーしたり、タンクをちょっとやったりしましたけども、全般的に見てほとんど無防御という形ですから、やられたらもうライターのように火がつくと、そういう弱点があったですね。こちらから攻めていく場合、何百マイル飛んでいく場合には、もうどういうものか日本軍は生きて領収の恥ずかしみを受けるという、絶対に捕虜にならないという考えでしたから、そういう強制されたもんじゃなかったんですけども、攻めていく場合には落下傘持ってきませんでしたね。落下傘はもちろん座布団、クッション代わりに持っていきますけども、バンドをもう置いていっちゃうんです。だから落下傘持っていかないと同じで、敵地上でやられたらもう自爆する以外ないと。今考えればもったいないことで、それで随分死んでるんですけどもね。右の目はほとんど見えなくなってますし、左の目もやられてもうほとんど失明状態で、 コンパスが全然見えないんですよね。ちょうどここへ、一発はこういう弾が当たってますね。そしてこれへ抜けたんですね。
これ抜けてるわけですか。
でその時の傷がこの傷ですけどもね。それから一発はこっちから入って、でこれをかすったんですね。
なるほど。
だからほとんど失神状態で頭やられたってことも後で分かったんですけどもね。それからその時血を止めたのが最後のマフラーこれ残りまして、これで、血を止めたんですよ。この地図のようにですね、航路がめちゃくちゃでしょ。島も何にもないとこ行ってしまって、このまま行ったらハワイ行ってしまうと思ったんです。ラボールはこの辺にあるような感じがするんですよ。自分の飛行の癖と飛行機の癖を見ましてね。それで見えた瞬間に起点が取れませんから、地球上のどこにいるかわからないですから、コンパス見えても、それどうもこの辺にあると思ったけどもね、ここまで来て30度や40度ケチケチするなと思ってですね、男らしく直角に曲がれと思って直角に曲がったわけですよ。それがドンピシャリ当たったわけです。こういうような、15ラウンド戦ったボクサーの姿みたいですよね。顔の格好も歪んでしまって。
Beautiful restoration and getting our acquisitions taken over.
Have a good flight?
You bet.
Good.
How's it going?
Okay. That's it?
I think he's about 20 minutes behind me.
Oh, okay.
Between 20 and 30, so
I see.
it won't be too long, but...
Yeah. He saw the came part way yesterday, didn't he?
He got to Colorado Springs, yep.
Uh-huh.
And then he'll be, just this trip here, and he's looking forward to it, too.
Yeah, that's great.
So, and Steve, the guy flying it, he did all the work to it.
Yeah.
So he knows that airplane better than anybody as far as,
right.
spending the last 3 years.
Yeah, he's flying. That's the kind of people we need to do those kind of work.
Yep.
Sounds familiar. Oh, this sounds powerful. Oh, yeah. Big airplane.
We'll take a look.
Oh, it's Dan.
Oh, Steve Jr. Right?
So
Yeah, that's
dandy.
Steve Jr. Okay.
Here's Don. Get out of his seat here real quick.
Looks good, doesn't it?
Oh, man. Wow.
How you doing, sir?
Thanks for ringing it.
Oh, sorry we're a little late.
Yeah.
Worth the wait.
Wait.
Oh.
Oh, looks good. Good to see you. Good to see you. Don, this is Steve.
Glad to know you, Steve.
Privileged to meet you.
I think maybe I met your dad years ago.
Oh, that would make sense, yeah.
Yeah.
I understand you've been just as eager as Evan, if not more, so.
Yeah, all right.
It's finally here for you.
It's been joint excitement we've had for a while. But this is great.
Knock on wood, it's running absolutely perfect. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great.
This is a once-in-a-lifetime experience, and to be able to work with Evan and his family with the project, and knowing that Don was going to be here, really, that was the push, is getting it here so that this man who deserves so much credit can take it in and experience it again. Because without you, this airplane wouldn't be here. So.
Yeah. Well, it's amazing to me. It's something I never dreamed that would ever happen in my lifetime. And I've always been interested in aviation. I've kind of followed it, although I haven't done any flying since I got out. But I've always kept an interest in it, and I love that Hellcat so much that he couldn't have done anything better than to tell me that he was going to restore one to where it would be flyable. It's just amazing to me. Even though we had a little wait to do it, why, it's certainly, I hope it's worthwhile to you, and I know it sure is to me.
Absolutely.
Well, this is amazing, this whole thing. And for one thing, the way people turned out, it just really makes me happy to see that people still are interested in learning about history and learning about some of the airplanes and so forth involved and the people involved. And I've felt all the way through that this needed to be honor of this airplane, and they've done a good job of that. So it's been a real exciting experience for me, and I appreciate it, and thank you for both of you guys. You're part of it.
And for us, getting to represent Don's Hellcat has been a great thing, because Don and I have met, we've known each other for 4 years, and through our getting to know each other and talking, I've learned so much about the Hellcat, so many good things, and being able to have an ace that we can talk to and talk. All of his stories he's told us are amazing. Don has been someone who has really helped inspire us to pursue the Hellcat restoration. Through the process, it's been hard to wait, like Don said. We've been talking a lot. Don and I have been shared many phone calls and conversations and visited his house, and it's just an honor to be able to talk with Don and know Don, to be able to have an airplane that he flew in World War II, and having Don give us permission to do that was so exciting. And the paint scheme, I think, is the coolest Hellcat paint scheme I've ever seen. But the best thing has been getting to know Don and getting to visit with him and hear all of his amazing stories, which are stories to me, but real life encounters for Don. And one of my favorite stories that Don's told me about, he has a couple, but one of them, because I couldn't wrap my head around imagining what he watched, but when he strafed the Japanese airfield, and after he strafed the field, he went up and circled the airfield as he watched his friend latch onto the back of a Zero and have a dogfight, and got to see his friend shoot him down. And Don told me, he said, that was like watching at the movies, only I got the front row seat from above. And other stories that Don's talked about, the detail of it just fascinates me, because I can't relate to that because I wasn't around when that happened. And another story about Don's friend that was with, I might be using the wrong terminology, but a commanding officer who he thought was very reckless, and he landed and talked to Don and voiced his concern that he didn't think he'd be around if he kept flying with this guy. And Don helped talk to a flight surgeon, if I remember right, and convinced him to let his friend change squadrons, which probably saved his life. But just a lot of really cool stories in addition to his kills. Well, the thing about the Hellcat that fascinates me is the fact that, for being the fighter they were, and how many high numbers that were produced, and 19-to-1 kill ratio, that there's only 6 of them flying now. And so for me, the mission moving from here is making sure that we take this airplane to a lot of the air shows, Oshkosh, different places we go, so people can see them. And in fact, for me, until I saw Steve's dad test fly this, I had never seen a Hellcat fly in my life. I'd never heard one run in person. So I just want to get the airplane out in front of the public so they can see the Hellcat, because they're really underrepresented in the warbird community. So we're really excited to have one in the Midwest here and get it out in front of people and share Don's stories and his squadron mates, and educate more people about them. And it's exciting, because up until recently I'd never seen one fly, and they fascinate me, and I think the warbird community is going to be really excited to see another Hellcat flying.
It had mentioned to me that Evan had purchased a Hellcat, and I had told my dad for quite a while I didn't want to work for him. I wanted to be in charge of my own project, to just kind of do things my way. And he just came to me and said, I'll be out of your hair, and if you want to work with Evan directly, it's all yours. So I never met Evan before, but he came to Chino, and the Hellcat came over, and that's where the adventure started. I was immediately excited by it. Talking with Evan off the bat, he had said his intention was to have the aircraft in Don's paint scheme, that Don was still active and involved with it, and that's a unique opportunity in itself. The fact that we're sitting here is just incredible. But also a big goal of Evan's was that the airplane was reliable, and he intended it on being kind of the flagship of the fleet, if you will. And that I also very much liked. You see a lot of warbirds today restored, and then they just go sit in the corner of a hangar. But Evan, as you heard, the mission to get the airplane out there so that people can see it and learn the history of it was also an inspiration for myself. And it really just was a great working dynamic between the two of us. He gave me a lot of rope. Hopefully I didn't hang myself with it too bad. But it was a great working relationship, and it really was just a tremendous experience because Evan was involved and his goals with the aircraft and what he sees for it in the future. As he said, he'd never seen a Hellcat fly until that first flight. So getting to see that through his eyes too, it just made it all that more special.
So at our museum, one of our biggest missions is to educate the youngest generation, teach them what the greatest generation did. And like Steve, I grew up, from a little kid on around airplanes, and I just love warbirds. When I was a kid, we never owned a warbird when I was a kid growing up. So I always wanted to be around them, and I'd go, look at them at Oshkosh and air shows. And now that I'm lucky enough to be able to fly them, if a kid comes up and wants to talk about, the airplane, I like to take the time and visit with them and tell them what I know about the airplanes. And a lot of times it's great because some of these kids that come to the museums, they're fanatics about airplanes. They know statistics. They can tell you more about the airplane statistically than sometimes we can. But you also come across those people that don't know anything about World War II. They've never heard of Pearl Harbor. They've never heard of D-Day. And it's important to talk to those kids and tell them what you know and give them that personal experience. Let them touch the airplane, get them in the airplane, and teach them about this greatest generation, because the sacrifices they made are amazing. And a lot of our younger generation and have to understand our freedom is given to us by this generation who gave up everything, put their lives on hold to go and fight evil to save our country and give us the freedoms we have today. So when people come to the museum and kids, it's important to us to make sure that everybody knows exactly what happened during World War II and give them the best experience they can, so they can leave having an understanding of what took place and understand the sacrifices made. We started the museum officially in 2012. From like 1993 on, we had P-51 and then a P-40 and did some restorations, but officially the museum opened in 2012, and my grandpa, Ray Fagan, was the inspiration behind it. He was in World War II in the 4th Infantry, and he was on the first wave of Normandy invasion on Utah Beach, liberation of Paris, which he said was not all parades. It was pretty scary, all the way to the Battle of the Bulge, and he was taken out of the battle there when he got injured. So we wanted to, my grandpa passed away in 2010, so he wasn't able to see it, but he was our inspiration behind it. So my parents, Ron and Diane, it was important for them and my family, my brother and our wives, to extend that and pay respect to the greatest generation. It's fascinating. My dad was in the 4th Infantry, which was the same infantry division in the U.S. Army as my grandpa was. He served in Vietnam. Neither of them were pilots, but both of them, while in the war, wished they were. And when they got back from the war, they started flying right away. And my grandpa got his license on a GI Bill, I think in 1946, and a steerman. And he did that because he had shell shock, and the Army doctor said, you need to get your mind off of what took place and got to find a hobby. And flying was his hobby, and he was a World War II veteran, loved nothing more. I mean, flying was his life. So we felt it was fitting to honor him and his generation with the museum.
Well, it's considerably different from Don's, obviously. There's not a war on. There's not a big rush in that sense. I don't have to fly off of a pitching carrier deck, which is also a nice comfort. But it is one of those things that you do recognize while you're flying the aircraft, because, it's a calm, controlled situation. Go through your checklists, and you wait for ideal conditions. If the weather's not great, you wait till the next day. The wind's not in your favor. So the airplane, it really is a great airplane to fly. It handles so well, and that's also an interesting comparison because we can compare it to other World War II aircraft that we fly. But in combat, as Don's been in with it, I think that's where the aircraft really takes on a different personality. Just from a pilot's perspective, the Hellcat is balanced really well. It's got very light ailerons. The elevator and the rudder are all harmonized very well, so you don't have a heavy stick force or a rudder pedal. The visibility out of the airplane maybe necessarily isn't as great as the P-51. It's got a unique personality in that sense. I don't know how that would be with combat looking for enemy aircraft. I think it's a little restrictive in that sense, but the aircraft really it kind of hugs you when you get into it. You wear the airplane. It's not it's a very large aircraft, but I think in the cockpit it's not. It's a little bit tighter than what the aircraft appears. But it's very comfortable. It makes a lot of different noises and howls and whines, so it's got its own personality in that sense. But the R2800 engine is a very reliable engine, and I'm sure you guys were happy to have that in front of you. Yeah. And being a Grumman product, you just know that you're sitting on top of something that's built tremendously. So I'd say I'd rank it right up there with the top of the warbirds that I've flown. I think it doesn't have any bad traits. I believe their goal was to put a 200-hour pilot in it and send them to combat, and it definitely displays those capabilities.
Now our reconnaissance has spotted the Japanese task forces. This is the moment we've been fighting and praying for. Every plane that can fly and every qualified pilot is ordered into the air.
When I graduated from flight training at Corpus Christi, they already had my orders cut for Daytona Beach, Florida, and I was to start flying the Hellcat. Well, it's a one-seater, so, how do you learn to fly it? You don't have an instructor, to take you up and introduce you to the flights of it. So what they did, they gave you time enough to get in the cockpit and study all the instruments and the gauges and everything, and then they blindfolded you, and you had to pass a blindfold checkout. You didn't have to learn just every single little control, but you had to be blindfolded to be able to pick out the ones that were the most important when you were in flight. And so that was not much of a problem. You got by with that all right. And so then you just get in and you start flying it. And field carrier landings, they call them. You'd have a circle and marked out in the grass strip, and it was to prepare you for approaching carrier landings. And so you had to slip or slide the airplane, whichever you needed, to lose altitude so that you landed the wheels within those circles. So started out with that, then we went to formation flying, and then we started into tactics, tactics from formation, and also a lot of strafing on ground things, and we even did a lot of strafing at the towed nylon sleeve, towed by another plane. Once in a while, you had to take turns pulling the sleeves, so you kind of hope the guys don't give too much lead, So, but they had a pretty long rope, so it wasn't too much problem. So then it was time to qualify and carrier landings, and so we went to the Great Lakes, and they had two old luxury liners that had been converted to aircraft carriers, and they were considerably smaller than the regular aircraft carriers, that were in operation. And so I won't go into detail on that one. There's some kind of a funny story or two about that, but I got my 8 landings in, and then they did give me 10-day leave to go home. And so my wife and I spent a little time at home, and then I had orders cut for San Diego, California, and shipped out from there to Pearl Harbor. Got over at Pearl Harbor on Christmas Eve. And when I was training, after I got to Pearl Harbor, why I was supposed to be there 3 months, and after probably just a little over 2 months, why they got word that Air Group 83 at Malaya had a pilot killed in carrier landings. Now, I have no idea how my number come up, but anyway, one afternoon they flew me over to Maui, and when I got over there, I found out that they were all packed, ready to go to combat the next morning. So I got on a troop transport with guys I'd never met before, and we went to Ulithi and joined the Fast Carrier Task Force. They were there in Ulithi Harbor, and so basically, when I joined Air Group 83, we were already in the combat zone, and I had never flown with anybody at all. So for about the first, I think, if I remember right, about the first 4 or 5 days, I was not part of a division. They had it divided into divisions of 4. And it was probably about 2 weeks after I joined Division 1 or 5. The fleet had been under terrible kamikaze attacks, and they thought this little island of Kikishima maybe was an airfield where some of those suiciders were departing from. And so our orders to the 4 of us were to go over there and tear that place out the best we could. And we were armed with rockets, and of course, the full complement of 50 caliber ammunition. And so we tore the place up pretty bad. And when we started back to the carrier, then, I mean, we had just gotten started back on our route back to the carrier, and all of a sudden, I was flying wing on my aviation leader, and all of a sudden, here was these 2 Japanese dive bombers on a converging course. But we probably were only maybe at 1,800 feet off the water, but those guys were hugging the ocean. I mean, they were really down low. So the only thing I had time to do is lucky I still had my guns off safety. Was just pushing the nose down and put my sight on him and squeezed the trigger, and I saw the pilot slump forward, and of course they immediately crashed into the ocean. Well, then I made a wing over turn to see what happened to the second guy, and he was, of course, nobody had jumped on him, and so I poured almost full throttle to the Hellcat, and it responded really well, and just as I was pulling the trigger while my division leader was hollering at me on the phone, he said, "Don, get out of there. They're shooting at you from shore batteries." But I squeezed the trigger, and that one exploded. And so I did a wing over, and probably the most violent maneuvering I did to get out of there without getting shot down myself. So that was the first time. Well, then after probably a month or so later, we'd been just banging around on Okinawa, something fairs, prior to the invasion. And finally, then, just after the invasion, they still had some of the destroyer ships positioned north of Okinawa, between Okinawa and the next big island of Kyushu, as radar pickets, to pick up enemy planes coming in. And so one day while they vectored us, well, actually they sent all of the fighters Hellcat on the Essex and one other carrier over there. And they're estimating now that there must have been at least 300 kamikaze suicide fighters coming in, attacking those ships and anything they could, trying to still kind of take Okinawa back at that point. And so we got into quite a situation there then. division leader was still on his wing, and we saw a kamikaze heading for one of the destroyers, and so we dived on it, and we didn't realize that the seaplane was so slow, so we overshot that one, but there was a second one, and I shot the second one down. Well, then the division leader, he got on the radio, and he said, guys, split up and just fight individually and get as many of these as you can, because the air was just full of these kamikazes. So that's what we did, and so I ended up then shooting down 3 that day, which then made me my 5 to make ace. And the division leader shot down, he had gotten 1 before, he shot down 3, so I was sorry he missed ace by 1. But then the section leader, he had had 1 before, and then he got 4 that day, so that made him an ace. And then the what we call Taylor and Charlie, the last guy in the division, he got up at a little higher altitude with another level of kamikazes where you had more room to maneuver, and he ended up with 6 that day, so he became ace in the day, and he ended up for the war then 7. So in the whole 6 months, why our division of 4 accounted for 21 kills.
Wow. You know, and in this communication with Evan, it was very good in that sense. You know, obviously the question always is, well, you know, when do you think it'll be done? And going into aircraft restoration, you know, for the most part, it's a pretty clear-cut path, but then things arise and pop up, which kind of deters that course. But I'd say from the get-go, there was already a fire lit under us, you know, to get this reunion to occur with Don. And that's the big driver, and that was the big driver with Evan. You know, I'm sure he's chomping at the bit to go fly it immediately as well. But that was set off to the side, and the focus was really, you know, making sure that we could bring the airplane here so that Don had a chance to visit with it and you know, rekindle those experiences. You know, flying these aircraft, whether it's a first flight or a 100th flight, there's a big level of responsibility that comes with that. As nice as it would be to say that you can just go jump in the airplane and not think twice about it, you know, there's a lot going on. The airplanes obviously have an increased value today. But I think the reason that we're able to continue to do that type of flying is because we're mechanically hands-on with them. So, you know, when you move a lever, you're not simply moving a lever, it's, you know, actuating a hydraulic cylinder. You can picture that in your head. So when you start getting into troubleshooting situations, you have a more clear train of thought, not an instant panic type of thing. But again, it's there's a lot that goes into it, and you know, flying it's obviously the epitome of the mission and the journey. But you know, the journey is a long road to get to that point. Well, I'd say that the day could not have gone any better. To meet Don in person after hearing of his conversations with Evan, this is just a once-in-a-lifetime experience for myself. And to have the airplane sitting behind us, it really completed the mission. I think to echo Evan's statements, it's important that these aircraft continue to fly and gentlemen like Don tell their stories, because this new generation or newer generations, they can't comprehend it. And unless the stories are out there, the airplanes are out there flying, there's no visibility without that. So it's important for us to move forward and remember what happened in the past so that we don't repeat those mistakes in the future.
For me today was great. You know, we've talked about this for 4 years, and when I taxied up and saw the American flags and Legion riders and all your family and friends, it was just what I pictured. You know, and the weather was great, and you know, the experience getting to this point with you has been a lot of fun, and you know, I'll continue that friendship with you for a long time, and look forward to sharing the airplane with you.
Yeah.
And like Steve said, I mean, your generation, the greatest generation, are the reason we're here today and have the freedoms we do, whether people realize it or not. So like Steve said, you know, thank you and your generation for your service. We owe you a lot. Okay, well, today we're getting near the end of our visit in Beatrice with Don and his family and friends, and Don's gonna do a walk around of the Hellcat with us and show us some of the features of it and tell us about characteristics of the Hellcat, since he has a lot of experience flying them. And so we're gonna listen to Don and do a walk around.
Well, I think everybody's pretty much familiar with the engine, the R2800, and it had water injection. It was right on the throttle. If you jammed the throttle full forward, it kicked in the water injection, and that would increase your horsepower by 15%.
Wow.
And
Could you feel that?
You could feel it when it caught, but they didn't want you using it for very long because it could be injurious to the engine. So
sure, I would imagine.
You just used it in a short period of time. And I guess they messed around with some of the later Hellcats by replacing one of the guns and putting a cannon in, but I'm not aware that we ever had any. They said they used that some in the night fighters, but I'm not sure about that. So, of course, the propeller is adjustable, variable speed propeller.
I know the prop is very long on it, the ham standard prop, and I know they advise you to take off tail low in the 3-point, and they want you to land in a 3-point setting.
Yeah.
Because the prop comes down so close. I forget how many inch clearance it has, but unlike the Mustang where you put the tail up when you're taking off to sea, you want to stay in that 3-point.
Yeah, you have to do it
so
almost backwards.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Right. And of course the folding wings on it.
Yeah.
That's a different way of doing things with the carrier-based airplanes,
Yeah.
with the wings fold, right?
Okay, then another thing I might add, just to remember, you mentioned a while ago through the hooks there.
Yep, right here.
But like if you're going to be catapulted off, like if the deck is almost full of planes, you don't have room enough to make a running takeoff, then they have a track in the deck. It's a catapult track, and you taxi up, straddle of it, and then with your proper position while you hold the brakes, and they hook a cable from there up to those hooks. All right, when they're all hooked up and everything, then they signal when you're ready, so you hold the brakes and you run up full throttle, lay your head back against the headrest, and then they fire that catapult, and by the time it's just a short Oh, I guess like from here to that airplane or
Wow.
so, you've got 70 knots
Wow.
flying speed.
That's amazing.
It just feels like it's pulling the skin back on your face like this. And they will not fire unless you have your head back because they claim it can break your neck.
Wow.
So,
That's some...
but that way they can get planes off. Most of the carriers had two catapult channels. Ours, we only had one that was working because the Essex had taken a kamikaze and damaged the other one. So we only had one to use. So.
Let's go back over to the tail here.
Yeah, you can see the tail hook there.
Yep.
You from in the cockpit, you put the tail hook down when you, and so forth, and then it sticks down by a pretty good angle. And some people say, well, why do you have a signal officer, the landing signal officer? Mainly the basics for his need is the fixing of the deck.
Okay.
You know, you can kind of see it when you're coming in, but not to the extent of it. And so he's standing on the deck so he can feel it, and he will not land you unless the deck's going to be coming to you.
Okay, that's
if you're almost to the apex, you see, by the time you get there, it'll settle away from you. Your tail hook will miss and the rest of the water.
Darn.
And you then end up in the barrier halfway up the deck. It's pretty needful that you watch for these.
Oh yeah, I bet.
Basically, when you make your turn around the tail end of the carrier, while you have your goggles down, and you actually have your head you're in a tight turn. You have your head kind of outside the windshield, so nothing obstructs you.
Yep.
So you
got a good picture.
Everyone moves that signal officer with his paddles out.
Yep.
If you're flying, he's got a Roger, they call it. So
okay.
If you're too high, too low. If you're too fast, he'll do this. And then if you're too slow, he'll give you a come on. And so
wow, you have all the details. That's awesome.
Yeah.
I'm sure you had to have a good picture because your life depended on that signal officer giving you the right signals.
Another thing, then he has to be sure that barrier is back up after they land the guy ahead of you, see. So most of those guys are pilots.
Well, that's very neat. It's very neat. Well, Don, thanks for doing the walk around and explaining a lot of the details of the Hellcat and the characteristics and stuff like that. It's been great to hear them firsthand from you and experience it today with you here in Beatrice. So thank you for walking around this with me.
Okay.
And then beautiful restoration and the newer acquisitions taking. They're finally here. You gotta see this show. As the Corsairs moves down to take on the Zero. Ladies and gentlemen, the sound around and the music of their engines only, the Navy flyby.